welcome to SciFi-preneurship, an All Turtles podcast series that takes a look at how science fiction inspires people to envision the future and then create it. And on this topic, actually, probably more than anything, because we're talking about Ursula K Le Guin, who very explicitly wrote in a lot of her introductions, her kind of outside of her books, writings and speaking about how this was the job of sci-fi, that the job of sci-fi was not meant to be predictive, but meant to be prescriptive.
Her stories have been so influential that many of our guests actually wanted to talk about her work. So many, in fact, that we're dividing it into two parts. We talk about three separate stories, the dispossessed and the short story, the ones who walk away from Omelis. But in this episode, we focus on the left hand of darkness.
We're joined by great guests, as always. We've got Emily Dean back on the show. Emily is a writer and director.
And Sophia Bruckner's back as well. She's a professor with an art and computer science background.
Veronica Belmont, a well-known internet person, currently product manager at Adobe and the co-founder of the very popular Sword and Laser.
And here's Veronica.
So I first read Left Hand of Darkness recently, within the past 2 years, I would say. It was one of our Sword and Laser picks. And I just remember being really struck by how fascinating it is that I read a lot of science fiction. And in science fiction, anything is possible. But rarely do we get characters who are not pretty cut and dry, male, female, males like to have sex with females, et cetera, through the end of time. And this is one of the first ones I read where we weren't confined by that. It's a great piece of feminist, but also humanist fiction. And it delves into these ideas of ambisexuals and androgyny and all these things that, of course, should be possible. It's science fiction. Anything is possible. And yet no one really had the balls to do it as much as she has.
And there's just not a lot that goes on. It's not action-packed, and really that's not a bad thing. It's more of a philosophic work. A look at how the gender fluidity on Gethin affects different societal structures there. And for listeners who haven't read the work, a high-level summary of The Left Hand of Darkness. Genli, a male native of Terra, is sent to Gethin by the Ecumen, which is sort of a confederation of planets, as the first envoy there. And he's there to try to get the Gethenians to believe his story and join the Ecumen. But Genli has some trouble interacting with the Gethenians who don't have a fixed sex. Their sex changes over time. And he meets Estervan, and much of the novel involves the progression of their relationship as Genli begin to understand Estervan and the Gethenians.
It's very Lord of the Rings minus all of the heroism.
I do remember that there was some political drama too, because wasn't Genli trying to convince the local government that there was a ship?
Right. They don't believe him. The concept of a flying machine is a bit lost on the Gethenians. They don't have birds or flying insects, so it's hard to imagine flying when you've never seen it before.
That was one of the things that really struck me when I first read the book, is this idea that, like, yeah, there's a society and, like, they don't have birds. Birds never evolved on the planet, so like stuff doesn't fly around, and so it never occurs to them to like make airplanes. Even though it's fairly technologically advanced, they just get everywhere by driving very slowly.
In really terrible weather.
Yeah. But it kind of makes sense because then, you know, it's just structure the society where you don't really need to be anywhere far in a matter of hours. And, you know, like what would we be much worse off if we didn't have air travel? Like it's hard to say. Like I spend maybe half my life on an airplane. But if that wasn't a thing that people did, like it just wouldn't occur to anyone that you should have an office in San Francisco and another one in Tokyo and constantly go back and forth between them. Like if that just was not a thing that people did, what would it mean? Kind of made me think about what other things do we have going on that we just kind of take for granted because that's the way that it occurred to somebody. It may have occurred in a different way.
Well, it's basically... Would we have very fast trains? I mean, we have fast trains, but would we have like...
But we don't. Other countries do.
Yeah, let's be real. We can't even build one from LA to SF.
Yeah.
I know, we're bad at that. Yeah. We're super bad at fast trains over here. But maybe we would have been forced to be good at it without the invention of air travel. If we didn't have birds to even think about that, like you were saying. It's a cool thought exercise. What would we have gotten good at?
Yeah, if we didn't have things to model ourselves after.
Another thing that I really thought was interesting in Left-Handed Darkness was this idea that the society, and it was explained mostly along gender lines, which seems maybe believable, but it was a society that had a lot of conflict but no war. Like there was no concept of war. There was skirmishes, there were guns, there was violence, there was people mad at each other. There was even like tribes or families that would, fall into conflict once in a while. But there was no concept of like one society versus another as a war. It just wasn't a thing that happened. I think when the book takes place, like one of the societies is moving in the direction where they may, because of people being overly demagogic and dogmatic, like they're afraid that they may move into something where it may resemble permanent war. And of course, like that's our world right now, like much more so than when the book was written. Like our world right now is permanent war, and it's all war talk. It's all U.S. versus China. It's all about AI or whatever. Like everything is cast as this as like a long-term systemic conflict, not just like not a skirmish or a spat. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was a very interesting model to like, how can we think about having conflict and having disagreements and even having violence and crime and all that stuff, but without this idea that it's a society engulfing organized activity called war.
And then where is the connection too between the gender conversation and the conflict conversation? Because I think there's some things that tie that together as well in a society that is not necessarily male or female or interchangeable, and roles are being reversed all the time, and who cares for the young. I think there's some interesting parallels that you can make there as well.
Right. Yeah, I think for listeners who may not know, like the central conceit in this work is that this is a society of people who, like, each person kind of has a period where they're male and a period when they're female and a period where they're kind of androgynous. And so there's no permanent gender. And just sort of an exploration of what happens with that structure. And the whole war talk was this idea is like, yeah, there is no permanent class of people that can afford to like go off and fight somewhere in an organized way. Mm-hmm. So your conflicts are pretty limited in scope, although they're no less brutal, but they're personal. There's no like systemic kind of state-sponsored conflict.
This is actually how I consider myself in terms of conflict. Very personal, very brutal, but very short-lived.
That's right. Yeah. It's the healthier way to...
I like to fight my battles.
That's right.
Get it out and over with quickly. Don't let it fester.
Exactly.
The two societies that are on the planet in Left-Handed Darkness, one of them is very much the technology and the thrust of what I think most people are doing is there for kind of physical comfort and survival. Like they're in a harsh environment. It's snowing all the time. It's super cold. There's a lot of scarcity. And they've managed to like make a civilization that kind of works. And they're relatively advanced and they're comfortable, but they're occupied mentally by mostly dealing with like the physical reality. And then there's a second society which has kind of moved a little bit beyond that. And now they're occupied mentally, getting more and more so with the intersubjective reality, with politics, with the dogma, with like who's thinking correctly and who's not thinking correctly. And it's almost a story about how like as we start paying more and more attention to the virtual stuff, to the land of ideas, and we start having, good ideas and bad ideas and people who are right thinking and people who are wrong thinking, that's when it all becomes really dangerous because it's not moored to the actual objective reality. Well, there's a lot of snow and we have to like stay warm and get food. It's, well, we have to think about things correctly, and these people aren't, and so they're the enemy, and you get all of the politics. And seeing our world transition into that, I think, has also been interesting, where as we've solved a bunch of the actual material problems, what's occupying our minds mostly, minds/Twitter feeds, is this like very subjective battleground of ideas, and the fake battleground of ideas being maybe more dangerous than the real one, especially when it means we ignore like the real stuff, like potentially climate change and things like that.
Perfect example. Yeah. Damn, that was dark too.
We'll put in happy music at the end of this. It'll be fine. Thanks to Veronica for joining us. Next up, we have Emily Dean. She's back in the studio. Emily is a Pixar-trained screenwriter and director. We were having a longer conversation with Emily about some other works, but she wanted to make sure she shared a few brief thoughts about Ursula K Le Guin because, like many of us, she found Ursula's work to be particularly inspiring. Let's hear why.
I did want to say a little bit about Ursula Le Guin, just about how her creative process is such a beacon and a shining light for myself as a creative working in speculative fiction, science fiction, and fantasy, and how she kind of talks about being this internal emigre and how creating work in science fiction is a process of translation, and it's really not an intellectual or cerebral process, but rather it's one of distancing and pulling back from reality in order to see the world better. And I think that's really what science fiction gives us. It allows us to take a step back and assess our own society and our place in society through different lenses. And it's a view in. It's like a voyage through somebody's psychic processing of the society, the place, time that they are currently living in. And I think science fiction has a role in myth making. And when you don't have science fiction that's really doing the hard work of commenting, critiquing, and pushing and pulling theories of society and personhood, you start to see a kind of slippage, I think, in the conversation. And science fiction has a moral and a social purpose to create genuine and serious standards. I know that's an out there idea, but her work, particularly in environmentalism, her philosophy, her translations of Taoism. I think there's a quote that she says in some of her essays, and I really love her essays, which is that we read books to find out who we are, what other people, real or imaginary, do and think and feel, or how they have done and thought and felt. And it's an essential guide for understanding ourselves and what we might become.
That's the actual quote we read to ground us for this series.
Really?
Yeah.
So that for me is like a moral compass to creating science fiction and to creating stories, is how is my work positively impacting the reader, the audience, the consumer of what it is that I'm making, and how can it help push toward a new world? So in that sense, I'm a utopian in science fiction.
Emily's far from the only person we talked to who shared great admiration for Ursula K Le Guin. Sophia Bruckner, artist, computer scientist, and professor at the University of Michigan, holds Le Guin's work in similarly high regard. Here's Sophia.
Have you felt like Ursula K Le Guin and her work was an inspiration to you?
Definitely. She's my hero. She's always been a very important person in thinking about my work. Even though she's not really talking about specific gadgets or technologies the way that people who write hard sci-fi do, just the thoroughness of world building. She asks a what-if question and she answers it so thoroughly. Just that way of thinking about things really resonates with me. And I wish that more authors who are doing hard sci-fi, who think about a particular technology or gadget existing, would answer the question about the implications on society and people and relationships and the perception of the self as thoroughly as she answers those questions.
From the Left Hand of Darkness, is there something that you identified with, or what is it about that story in particular that inspired you to where you are today?
I think it's just the thoroughness, because she's asking what would happen if there was a world where binary gender didn't exist. And she didn't just tell one story about it. She actually explored multiple stories, multiple ways society might be structured if that were true. And I thought that was just really wonderful in a work of speculative fiction, because the first world they explore is more, it's ruled by a king, and she talks about all the implications of that sort of a government structure with that assumption about gender for the first half of the book, and then she goes to a whole nother community on the same world where the same assumption about gender exists, but the government structure is completely different, and she just very thoroughly explores both. And the thoroughness is what really inspires me. I kept thinking about how on this world they never thought of planes because they have no birds.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something we've talked about a few times, yeah.
And that's like one of the things that I always think about. And I'm like, well, what are we not thinking of because we don't have what is ever our version of birds?
Yeah, we've thought about that a lot, and it's obviously very hard to think about that.
Yeah. Exactly.
But yeah.
I like how that book makes me think about what my blinders are, or I don't know what they are, but it makes me aware that I have them.
Yeah. And the fact that that the population changes genders, right, goes through phases of being male and female and then asexual, and how that there is no permanent class of people that get to afford to, think about war. It keeps all the conflicts at they're just as vicious, if not more vicious, but it's all like all the conflicts are assassinations and violence and, skirmishes. I think they call the weapons skirmish guns or something, but they're not like politically organized conflict.
She's like a perfect person who embodies like this critical optimism I talk about. She talks about the need for leaders who are hopeful, but are also able to predict where things can go wrong and somehow not necessarily balance these things out, but work with both and not, give up. Because I think actually becoming really cynical is a form of passivity, and becoming blindly optimistic is another form of passivity. And actually, I think it's Donna Haraway she recently wrote a book called Staying with the Trouble. And I think that's actually kind of what Ursula K Le Guin was talking about. It's just this ability to stay in the gray area and to keep staying aware of where things are going wrong and keep struggling and keep moving forward and not falling to the easy. I think it's easy to fall to the extremes of blind optimism or total cynicism and dystopianism.
Thank you, Sophia. And that wraps up part 1 of our 2-part series within a series.
Series within a series.
Ursula K Le Guin. Take us out with your most influential quote.
Yeah, so this is from The Left Hand of Darkness. To learn which questions are unanswerable and not to answer them. This skill is most needful in times of stress and darkness.
This episode is a production of the All Turtles Worldwide Media Empire. We recorded this episode in the world-class Donatello Studios in San Francisco, California. Thanks to Veronica Belmont, Emily Dean, and Sophia Bruckner for joining us today. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, send us an email to hello@all-turtles.com. Marie reads every message. Thanks to everyone who made this episode possible, including Jim Metzendorf for editing. Little known fact, Jim has the left and right hand of darkness. Marie McCoy-Thompson for producing, Chris Plogue for his audio expertise, Ali Packard for our artwork, and Matt Ammerman for our theme music. On behalf of Brittney Gallagher and yours truly, Phil Libin, and the rest of the Old Turtles team, thanks for listening.